There was a ritual the Emperor refused to finish, not because it failed, because it worked. A weapon so absolute it could erase the warp itself and everything humanity had become along with it. The Imperium exists because this power was buried. But buried things don't stay hidden forever. What happens when the only thing left to fear is salvation? I found it on a morning when the dust hung motionless in the lamplight and the silence felt like a held breath. My name is Malcador Holt, and I am nobody of consequence. I was nobody then, and I remain nobody now as I compose these words in what I know are my final hours. I served the nascent Imperium as a junior archivist in the Sigillites Administrative Corps during the last throes of unification, cataloguing the endless river of parchment, data slate, and corrupted cogitator scroll that flowed from the conquered territories into the vaults beneath the Himalasian fortresses. My work was tedium incarnate. I sorted, I indexed, I transcribed, I filed. I lived in lamplight and ink fumes. I knew the textures of vellum better than I knew the faces of my own family, whom I had not seen in 7 years. The crusade was beginning to unfold beyond Terra's atmosphere, and the galaxy was opening like a wound, but my war was fought in silence against entropy and the slow degradation of parchment. The archive where I labored occupied 13 subterranean levels carved into bedrock beneath what had once been called the Palace of Kings. The Emperor himself had walked those corridors in the years before his ambitions turned skyward. We who worked there rarely spoke. The air was dry and bitter with preservation chemicals. Our robes whispered, our quills scratched. Somewhere far above us, the engines of conquest roared, but down in the archives, time moved differently. Hours bled into one another, days became indistinguishable. I have no memory of weather from those years. I remember only the unchanging yellow glow of sodium lamps and the weight of secrets I did not yet understand. I was assigned to Sub-Level 9, Section Tertius, Chamber 47. My task was the reorganization of materials recovered from the techno-barbarian fortress of Nathan Doom, a warlord whose domain had been reduced to ash and memory 3 years prior. The materials were fragmentary, corrupted by age and deliberate sabotage, written in 17 different cipher systems and 4 extinct languages. Most were salvage logs, supply manifests, propaganda broadcasts, dross. But protocol demanded that every scrap be assessed, catalogued, and preserved. Waste nothing. Forget nothing. The Imperium was being built on such tedious foundations. It was in the 9th crate, beneath a pile of scorched battlefield dispatches, that I found the first fragment. The parchment was wrong. That was my first thought. It was too smooth, too pale, as though it had been made yesterday rather than centuries ago. The ink had not faded. The edges were precise, cut with a blade so fine that the fibers had not frayed. It was a single sheet, no larger than my hand, covered in dense Gothic script, too small to read without magnification. I held it up to the lamp. The light passed through it in strange ways, bending, lingering. I felt a coldness in my fingertips that did not come from the temperature of the chamber. I set it aside and continued my work, but my eyes kept returning to it. By the time my shift ended, I had found 3 more sheets like it, each hidden among mundane materials, each written in the same unnerving script. I brought them to my workstation and arranged them under the lens of my magnifier. What I saw made no immediate sense. The text was High Gothic, but archaic, predating even the earliest unification dialects I had studied. The syntax was formal, ritualistic. I recognized certain word patterns that suggested psychic taxonomy, the same sort of nomenclature used by the early telepathica institutes, but the phrasing was alien, clinical. I copied the text into my personal logbook, a habit I had developed to track my progress through particularly difficult materials. I told myself it was merely diligence. I did not sleep well that night. The text described something called the rite of severance. The language was oblique, filled with metaphor and elision, but the core concept was clear enough to unsettle me. It was a binding ritual, a mechanism for the permanent imprisonment of warp entities or phenomena through the creation of what the text called a null anchor, a psychic construct so absolute in its negation that it would sever the target from the Imperium entirely. The cost, however, was described in terms I struggled to parse: causal discontinuity, temporal fracture, the erasure of contingent futures. The words swam before my eyes. I read them again and again, trying to extract clarity, but the meaning remained just beyond my grasp. The archives did not encourage questions. We were told that our purpose was preservation, not comprehension. Understanding was the domain of others, those who possessed clearance and authority, but I could not let it go. The fragment haunted me. I began searching for related materials, cross-referencing the cipher signatures and linguistic markers. I found nothing for weeks. Then, in a collection of salvaged astropathic logs from the Indonesic block, I found a single line that referenced the rite by name. It had been mentioned in a report filed by a junior telepath during the suppression of the unspeaking cults, a techno-mystical sect that had resisted unification with psychic warfare until they were annihilated. The report was fragmentary, damaged by fire, but the line was intact. The rite of severance was real. It was not a myth or a mistranslation. I began to notice patterns in the archive itself. Certain materials had been deliberately separated, distributed across different chambers and sublevels. References to the rite appeared in no fewer than 8 distinct collections, each originating from a different conquered territory, each written in a different hand, but the terminology was always the same: null anchor, causal severance, temporal fracture. Whoever had catalogued these materials before me had not recognized the connection, or perhaps they had been instructed not to look. I became obsessed with reconstruction. I worked double shifts, foregoing rest, subsisting on recaf and ration paste. My skin grew pale. My hands trembled. My supervisors noticed nothing. I was invisible, a function of the archive rather than a person within it. The fragments began to form a shape. The rite of severance was not a single ritual but a framework, a psychic architecture that could be adapted to different targets and scales. It had been used, or attempted, at least 4 times during the Age of Strife. Each attempt had been catastrophic in ways the records could barely articulate. Entire cities had vanished. Bloodlines had been erased retroactively, their existence scrubbed from memory and record as though they had never been born. One fragment described a fortress that had been rendered conceptually impossible, its stones scattering into quantum uncertainty the moment the rite was enacted. The survivors of these events, where survivors existed, spoke of a silence that was not the absence of sound but the absence of meaning, a void so profound that language itself broke against it. But the rite had worked. That was the terrible truth. It had imprisoned its targets flawlessly. The entities or phenomena bound by it had been severed so completely from the warp that they ceased to exist in any dimension of reality. They were not destroyed, they were unmade. The ritual had functioned exactly as designed. So why had it been forbidden? The question gnawed at me. The records I had uncovered made no mention of condemnation or prohibition during the Age of Strife. The rite had been employed openly, desperately, by those who possessed the knowledge and the will. It was only after unification, after the Emperor's rise, that references to it began to appear in suppressed archives, in burned documents, in the wreckage of purged libraries. Someone had decided that this knowledge must not survive, someone with the authority to erase it from the nascent Imperium's collective memory. I thought I knew who that someone was. I began to dream of the Emperor. Not as he was depicted in the propaganda broadcasts, radiant and terrible and impossibly distant, but as a figure standing in a ruined chamber, his face shadowed, his hands raised in a gesture that might have been blessing or condemnation. In the dream, he spoke a single word, and the word unmade the world around him. I woke in the dark, my bedding soaked with cold sweat, the word still echoing in my skull. I could not remember it. I was grateful for that. The archive was a labyrinth, and I was learning its secret passages. I found a collection of astropathic transcripts that had been misfiled, marked as meteorological data. Among them was a conversation between two telepaths stationed at the Imperial Palace during the final year of unification. They spoke in code, but the code was simple, a substitution cipher used by low-level operatives. They discussed a project referred to only as Omega Terminus. The terminology was familiar. Null anchor, severance. One of the telepaths expressed doubt. The other reassured him. The Emperor has seen all outcomes, the message read. This path alone ensures survival. The conversation ended abruptly. Both telepaths had been executed 3 days later for reasons unspecified in the records. I sat in the silence of Chamber 47, the transcript trembling in my hands. The Emperor had known. He had not merely forbidden the rite of severance, he had studied it. Perhaps he had considered its use. And then he had chosen to suppress it, not because it was flawed, but because it functioned too perfectly. The realization settled over me like a shroud. I understood nothing and everything at once. The rite was not heretical in the way that chaos worship was heretical. It was not a corruption or a deviation. It was a tool, perhaps the most powerful tool humanity had ever devised for combating the warp. And the Emperor, who had waged war against the Imperium for centuries, who had bound daemons and silenced sorcerers and purged entire belief systems to starve the ruinous powers, had looked upon this tool and deemed it too dangerous to exist. Why? I found the answer in a place I should never have been. Sub-level 13 was restricted. Access required clearance I did not possess. But the archive was old, and security was inconsistent. There were gaps in the surveillance grid, blind corridors where the cogitators did not reach. I had learned their locations over the years, not through any intent to trespass, but simply through the accumulation of knowledge that comes from inhabiting a space for long enough. I told myself I would only look. I told myself I would leave no trace. I descended the spiraling iron staircase into the lowest levels, where the air tasted of metal and the lamps burned with a greenish tint that hurt my eyes. The chamber I sought was unmarked, a vault door recessed into stone. The lock was mechanical, an antique design that predated the Imperium. I had seen its like before in schematics. I carried a set of tools I had requisitioned under false pretenses, small implements designed for the restoration of delicate manuscripts. I worked the lock for 20 minutes, my heart hammering, my hands slick. The mechanism yielded. The door opened with a sound like a sigh. Inside was a single cogitator terminal, ancient and massive, its bulk filling half the chamber. Stacks of data wafers sat beside it, organized with military precision. I activated the terminal. It woke reluctantly, its screen flickering to life with amber light. I fed it one of the wafers. The text that appeared was labeled Project Chronos. The designation meant nothing to me, but the contents did. I read for hours, my eyes burning, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Project Chronos had been an Emperor-sanctioned investigation into the nature of causality and temporal mechanics, conducted in the final years of unification. The project's objective was to determine whether the threads of fate could be manipulated, whether the future could be rewritten through psychic means. The rite of severance had been one of several mechanisms studied. The Emperor himself had participated in the research, contributing theoretical models and experimental data. The project had concluded that the rite functioned by severing not just warp entities but the causal threads that connected them to the material universe. When enacted, the rite did not merely imprison its target, it erased all outcomes that stemmed from the target's existence. It rewrote history. It collapsed timelines. The implications were staggering. If the rite were used against a sufficiently significant warp phenomenon, the ripple effects would propagate across centuries, unmaking entire chains of causality. The Imperium itself might be unmade. Humanity's survival, which the Emperor had orchestrated across millennia, might cease to have been possible. The records describe this as ontological collapse, the failure of reality to cohere. The universe would not end, it would simply become incoherent, a meaningless scatter of contradictory events. and yet the right had been tested. I found the reports. 3 trials had been conducted in secret, each targeting minor warp entities bound within containment fields. The first trial had succeeded. The entity had been severed. The containment field had remained intact. The second trial had succeeded. The third trial had succeeded, but with an anomaly. The researchers reported a brief period of disorientation, a sensation of time stuttering. One of the telepaths involved in the trial had suffered a psychic hemorrhage and died, whispering about threads unraveling, about a future that no longer fit. The Emperor had ordered the project terminated immediately afterward. All materials were to be classified above the highest clearance levels. All personnel were to be reassigned or, where necessary, terminated. The right of severance was to be erased from Imperial knowledge. I understood then. The Emperor had not feared that the right would fail. He had feared that it would succeed. He had engineered humanity's survival through an incomprehensibly complex web of causal manipulations, guiding events across millennia to ensure that this moment, this Imperium, this future, would come to pass. The rite of severance was a blade capable of cutting those threads. If used recklessly, or even carefully, it could undo everything. It could erase the very conditions that made the Imperium possible. Humanity might survive, but it would be a different humanity, following a different path toward a different and possibly darker fate. Or it might not survive at all. The Emperor had looked into the potential futures and seen annihilation not through the right's failure but through its success. I sat in the cold green light of the terminal, my breath shallow, my thoughts unraveling. I had uncovered a weapon that could kill gods and unmake reality. I had learned a secret that the Emperor himself had tried to bury, and I had no idea what to do with it. The choice, of course, was not mine to make. I became aware of the footsteps before I heard them. It was a sensation, a prickling at the base of my skull, the feeling of being observed. I turned. The chamber door was still open. A figure stood in the threshold, robed in black, face hidden beneath a hood. I did not need to see the face to know what I was looking at. The insignia on the robe was small, almost invisible in the dim light, but I recognized it. The Inquisition. They had not yet formalized their structure, not yet become the vast and terrible engine of suppression they would one day be, but they existed. They had always existed, in one form or another, wherever the Emperor's will required absolute enforcement. The figure spoke. The voice was soft, male, devoid of inflection. "You have accessed restricted materials, Archivist Holt. You have violated protocols established under the direct authority of the Emperor. You understand the severity of this transgression." I tried to speak. My voice failed me. I nodded. The figure stepped into the chamber. I saw now that he was not alone. 2 others followed, similarly robed, silent. They moved with the precision of trained killers. I felt my legs weaken. I thought of running, though there was nowhere to run. I thought of pleading, though I knew it would accomplish nothing. Instead, I found my voice and asked the only question that mattered. "Why is it forbidden?" The figure paused. For a long moment, he did not answer. Then he said, "Because some powers should never be wielded, not by humanity, not by anyone. The right of severance is not heresy. It is not corruption. It is something worse. It is absolute. And the absolute is the enemy of survival." I understood. I did not agree, but I understood. The Emperor had built the Imperium on compromise, on necessity, on the careful management of terrible forces. He had bound Psykers, harnessed the warp, weaponized faith, committed genocides beyond counting, all in the name of humanity's continuation. But the rite of severance offered no compromise. It was binary. It was total. And in its totality, it threatened the delicate balance upon which everything rested. To use it would be to gamble all of humanity's future on a single action, with no possibility of correction, no room for adaptation. The Emperor, who had planned across millennia, could not tolerate such a weapon. It was too final, too irrevocable. The figure gestured. The two others moved toward me. I did not resist. They bound my hands with restraints that hummed with null energy, cold and hollow against my skin. The figure deactivated the terminal and collected the data wafers with gloved hands. He turned to me one last time. "You will be processed according to Imperial security protocols. Your work will be assessed. If it is determined that you have shared this knowledge, your entire bloodline will be expunged. If it is determined that you acted alone, your death will be swift and your name will be forgotten. You have one opportunity to speak. Have you communicated these findings to anyone?" I shook my head. The lie came easily. I had told no one. I had no one to tell. My isolation was complete. The figure nodded. "Then it will be swift." They led me out of the chamber, through the labyrinth of sub-level 13, up the spiraling stairs, through corridors I had walked for years but would never walk again. The archive continued around us, indifferent to my departure. Scribes worked at their stations. Lamps burned. Parchment rustled. I was already gone, already erased, even as I still drew breath. They brought me to a holding cell, a small cube of stone with a single lamp and a wooden bench. They removed the restraints and locked the door. I was alone. I do not know how long I sat there. Hours, perhaps. Time had lost its shape. I thought of the rite of severance, of the knowledge I had gathered, of the fragments I had painstakingly reconstructed. I thought of the Emperor, standing in a ruined chamber, raising his hands to unmake a word. I thought of the telepaths who had been executed, of the researchers whose work had been classified into oblivion, of the countless others who had glimpsed this secret and been silenced. I thought of the future, the vast and terrible future that the Emperor had engineered, and I wondered if he had been right. I wondered if humanity's survival truly required the suppression of absolute power. I wondered if the galaxy would have been better or worse if the right had been preserved, if it had been used, if it had unmade the conditions of the Imperium's birth. I will never know. That is the nature of forbidden knowledge. It offers no answers, only questions that devour the mind. The door opened. A different figure entered, younger, unrobed, carrying a sidearm. He gestured for me to stand. I obeyed. He led me down a corridor I did not recognize, through a door that opened onto a small courtyard. The sky above was dark, choked with the smoke of Terra's endless industry. I smelled ash and promethium. The figure positioned me against a wall. He stepped back. He raised the sidearm. I closed my eyes. The Emperor's design would continue. The Imperium would rise. The Great Crusade would spread across the stars. The knowledge I had uncovered would remain buried, waiting. And I, Malkador Holt, archivist of no consequence, would be forgotten. The shot was louder than I expected, but I am not yet finished. There is more to tell, though the telling grows difficult. The execution I anticipated did not occur in the manner I expected. The figure with the sidearm hesitated. I heard his breathing, rapid and unsteady. I opened my eyes. He was staring at me, his weapon wavering. Behind him, another figure had entered the courtyard, tall and cloaked, moving with the kind of silence that suggested augmentation or psychic discipline. The armed man turned, startled, and the newcomer spoke a single word. The man collapsed, his weapon clattering to the ground. I did not understand what I had witnessed. The newcomer approached me, and I saw his face beneath the hood. It was gaunt, scarred, the eyes pale and unreadable. He studied me for a long moment. "You are Malkador Holt," he said. It was not a question. I nodded, my voice lost. "You have uncovered the rite of severance. You have read the Chronos files. You have assembled enough of the framework to understand its function." He paused. "You are either the most foolish archivist in the Imperium or the most dangerous." I found words. I only sought to understand. "Understanding is the beginning of all heresy," he replied, "but also the beginning of all wisdom. The Emperor understands this. That is why he preserves knowledge even as he restricts it. That is why you still live." I did not feel alive. I felt hollowed, a vessel emptied of everything but fear. "Who are you?" "I serve the Sigillite," he said. "Malkador the hero, the first lord of terror, the Emperor's right hand. I have been tasked with observing the archive system for anomalies." "You are an anomaly, Archivist Holt. You have demonstrated initiative, intellect, and an alarming capacity for synthesis. These qualities make you valuable. They also make you a threat." He crouched beside the unconscious man, checking his pulse with clinical detachment. "This one will wake with no memory of the past hour. You, however, must make a choice. You may proceed to execution, as protocol demands. Your death will be recorded, your work will be destroyed. Or you may accept reassignment. You will be placed under direct supervision. Your knowledge will be monitored. You will never again have access to unrestricted materials. But you will live, and your skills will be utilized." I stared at him. "Why?" "Because the Imperium is vast, and the archive is infinite. The knowledge you have uncovered is not unique. It exists in fragments scattered across 1,000 worlds. Others will find it, as you did. When they do, we must know, we must intercept. And for that, we require archivists who understand what they are seeing. You have proven your capacity. Now you must prove your loyalty." I thought of the right, of the causal threads it could sever, of the futures it could unmake. I thought of the Emperor's design, vast and unknowable, stretching across ages. I thought of my insignificance, my invisibility, the years I had spent in lamplight and dust. I thought of survival. "I will serve," I said. The man nodded. "You will report to Sub-Level 7 at the beginning of the next shift. Your previous work will be archived under my authority. You will speak of this to no one. If you fail, your death will be neither swift nor painless. Do you understand?" "I understand." He rose and departed without another word, his cloak whispering against the stone. I stood alone in the courtyard, the unconscious man at my feet, the weight of my choice settling over me like a shroud. I had been given a reprieve, but it was not mercy, it was utilization. I was a tool now, calibrated and purposed, and tools do not question their use. I returned to the archive. I reported to Sub-Level 7. The work was different, more focused, more classified. I catalogued materials related to forbidden psychic research, to suppressed technologies, to knowledge deemed too dangerous for general access. I worked under constant observation, my every movement logged, my every notation reviewed. I learned to see the patterns, the recurring themes, the echoes of ancient mistakes that the Imperium sought to avoid. I became very good at my work. I became indispensable, and I never stopped thinking about the rite of severance. The years passed. Terror changed. The Great Crusade expanded, devouring the galaxy, and the archive swelled with the plunder of 1,000,000 worlds. New archivists were recruited, trained, deployed. I rose through the ranks, quietly, invisibly, until I was no longer junior but senior, no longer supervised but supervising. I trained others to recognize the forbidden, to flag the dangerous, to suppress the absolute. I became the thing I had once feared. I became the enforcer of ignorance. But the knowledge remained. I had memorized the fragments, the equations, the ritual structure. I could not unlearn it. It lived in my mind, a silent architecture, waiting. I told myself I would never use it. I told myself it was merely theoretical, an intellectual exercise, a ghost of a weapon that no longer existed. But the galaxy was changing. The crusade faltered. Whispers of betrayal began to circulate. The Emperor withdrew to Terra, locked within his gene laboratories, laboring over the project that would become the Primarchs. The Imperium grew, but it also grew fragile, its foundations straining under the weight of expansion. I began to wonder if the Emperor had been wrong. The thought was heresy, of course. To question the Emperor's wisdom was to question the very foundation of the Imperium. But I could not silence it. I had seen the records. I had read the projections. The Emperor had chosen to suppress the rite of severance because it threatened the causal framework of his design. But what if that design was flawed? What if the future he had engineered was not the only future, or even the best future? What if the right, properly used, could sever the threads of a darker fate and allow humanity to step onto a different path? I had no answers, only questions. And questions, I had learned, were the most dangerous things of all. The Inquisition came for me a second time in the 37th year of my service. I was older then, grayer, slower. My eyes ached from decades of lamplight. My hands trembled when I wrote. I had trained 3 generations of archivists, suppressed countless dangerous finds, become a fixture of the Sigilites' apparatus. I thought I was safe. I was wrong. They arrived without warning, a squad of black-robed operatives who sealed Sub-Level 7 and detained every archivist present. I was separated from the others and brought to a chamber I did not recognize, deep within the palace complex. The room was circular, its walls lined with cogitators and hololithic displays. At the center sat a figure I recognized from propaganda broadcasts, though I had never seen him in person. Malcador the Sigilite. The hero. The Emperor's voice. He regarded me with pale, ancient eyes. "Malcador Holt," he said. "You have served the Imperium faithfully for 37 years. Your work has been exemplary. Your loyalty has been unquestioned. And yet, here we are." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Malcador gestured, and one of the cogitators activated, projecting a stream of data into the air. I recognized it immediately. It was my own work, my cataloging of right-related materials over the decades. Every fragment I had flagged, every suppression I had recommended, every notation I had made, he had it all. And he had noticed the pattern. "You have been very thorough," Malcador said, "almost obsessively so. You have intercepted no fewer than 73 references to the rite of severance across 17 different collections. You have suppressed them all. You have trained your subordinates to do the same. On the surface, this appears to be exemplary service, but I have reviewed your notations. I have analyzed your language, and I have concluded that you are not suppressing the right. You are protecting it." The accusation hung in the air like a blade. I forced myself to meet his gaze. "I serve the Imperium." "You serve a memory," Malcador replied. "You serve the ghost of a weapon that should never have existed. You have convinced yourself that the rite of severance is too important to be forgotten, too powerful to be lost. You have been preserving it, piece by piece, under the guise of suppression. Am I wrong?" I could not lie to him. He would know. I said, "The knowledge exists. It cannot be unmade. If it is forgotten, it will be rediscovered. Better that we preserve it, control it, understand it, than allow it to resurface in ignorance." Malcador leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "That is the argument of every heretic who has ever sought to preserve forbidden law. It is rational, it is seductive, it is also catastrophically naive. The rite of severance is not a tool that can be controlled. It is an ontological weapon. Its very existence warps the psyche of those who study it. You have spent decades immersed in its fragments, and you have become blind to its effect on you. You believe you serve the Imperium. In truth, you serve the right. It has made you its custodian, its guardian, its priest, and that is why you must be removed." I felt the cold weight of finality. This time, there would be no reprieve. Malcador continued. "The Emperor foresaw this. He foresaw that the right would not die, that it would linger in the cracks and shadows, preserved by those who could not let it go. He foresaw archivists like you, well-meaning and brilliant and doomed. That is why he established protocols for your identification and termination. You are not the first, Archivist Holt. You will not be the last. But you will be silenced, and the knowledge you have protected will be scattered once more, buried deeper, made harder to find. The cycle will continue. The right will remain incomplete, and humanity will survive because of it." He gestured. The operatives moved toward me. I did not resist. There was no point. But I spoke, one final time, driven by a need I did not fully understand. The Emperor fears the right because it works, because it could sever the warp itself, free humanity from the Imperium, end the endless war. He fears it because it is a solution he cannot control. Malkador's expression softened just for a moment, and I saw something like pity in his eyes. The Emperor does not fear the right, he said quietly. He fears what comes after. The warp is not separate from humanity. It is a reflection of us, a mirror of our thoughts and passions and sins. To sever it would not free us. It would leave us hollow, soulless, less than we are. The Emperor has seen that future. It is a future of dust and silence, of a humanity that survives but does not live. The rite of severance is not salvation, it is amputation, and he will not permit it. The operatives bound my hands. I was led from the chamber, through corridors of polished stone, past servitors and soldiers and functionaries who did not look at me. I was already erased. I descended into the depths, into levels I had never seen, where the air was cold and the walls wept condensation. They brought me to a cell, smaller than the first, with no lamp, no bench, only darkness. I sat in the dark for a long time, thinking of nothing and everything. I thought of the rite, of the fragments I had memorized, of the knowledge that would die with me. I thought of the Emperor, of his grand design, of the causal threads he had woven across millennia. I thought of the future, bright and terrible, that he had promised. I thought of the alternative, the silence, the hollowness, the dust. I thought of my choice, and I wondered if I had made it, or if it had been made for me. The door opened. A figure entered, hooded and silent. I did not recognize them. They carried a device, small and angular, humming with restrained energy. A psychic nullifier, I realized. They would use it to erase my memories before the execution, to ensure that even in death, I could not carry the knowledge forward. I felt a flicker of relief. I did not want to remember. I did not want to carry this burden into whatever darkness awaited. The figure activated the device. I felt the null field expand, cold and invasive, pressing against my skull. My thoughts began to fray, to scatter, to lose coherence. I tried to hold onto the right, to preserve it, but it slipped away like water through my fingers. The equations dissolved. The ritual structure collapsed. The fragments became noise, meaningless, gone. I felt myself becoming empty. The figure deactivated the device and stepped back. They removed their hood, and I saw a young woman, pale and sharp-eyed, an archivist's robes beneath her cloak. She looked at me with something like sorrow. "I am sorry," she said. "But this is necessary. You understand that, don't you?" I tried to answer, but I no longer remembered the question. I no longer remembered why I was here. I no longer remembered my name. She departed, and I was alone in the darkness. No longer Malkador Holt, no longer anyone, just a shell waiting for the end. But something remained. Deep in the lowest regions of my mind, beneath the nullfield's reach, a single fragment persisted. A phrase. A concept. Causal severance. I did not know what it meant. I did not know why it mattered. But it was there. A seed, waiting. The execution came hours later. A different operative, faceless, efficient. The shot was precise. I felt nothing, but the knowledge did not die. The rite of severance is not a thing that can be killed. It is not a manuscript that can be burned, a cogitator file that can be deleted. It is an idea, a structure, a pattern woven into the fabric of possibility. It exists because it must exist, because the universe contains the conditions for its existence. To erase it would require the erasure of causality itself, and that is precisely what the rite offers. It is a paradox, a weapon that can only be destroyed by its own use, and so it persists, waiting. The Emperor understood this. Malkador understood this. They did not seek to destroy the rite. They sought to contain it, to ensure it remained incomplete, scattered, inaccessible. But containment is not destruction. And in the long centuries that followed, as the Imperium grew and fractured and bled, the fragments continued to surface. Archivists found them. Inquisitors suppressed them. The cycle repeated, again and again. A slow and endless war against knowledge itself. And in that war, the right waited, patient, absolute, inevitable. I have written this account from beyond death, reconstructed from fragments, from echoes, from the memories of those who came after me. I am Malcador Holt, and I am no one. I am the first of many, the custodian of a weapon that should not exist, the guardian of a secret that cannot die. My execution changed nothing. The right remains. It will always remain. And one day, when the galaxy is desperate enough, when the Imperium is broken enough, when the Emperor's design has finally failed, someone will find it, someone will assemble it, someone will use it, and they will unmake everything. That is the truth the Emperor fears. Not that the right will fail, but that it will succeed. Not that it is weak, but that it is absolute. Not that it is heresy, but that it is a solution so final, so total, that it leaves no room for the compromises upon which survival depends. The Imperium exists because the right was never completed. Humanity endures because the weapon was never wielded. The Emperor's grand design persists because the alternative, the silence, the causal collapse, the ontological void, was deemed worse than any horror the warp could offer. But that calculus may change. The galaxy is vast, and the future is long, and desperation erodes all wisdom. The rite of severance is patient. It does not need champions or believers. It needs only time, and the certainty that eventually someone will be desperate enough to reach for it. I was that someone, once. I failed. Others will come. The cycle will continue. The fragments will scatter and reform. The knowledge will persist. And the Emperor, enthroned in gold and silence, will watch and wait and hope that the desperation never becomes absolute. But hope is not certainty. And the right does not care about hope. I close now with the only truth I learned in my years of service, the only lesson worth preserving. Some powers are forbidden not because they do not work, but because they work too well. The rite of severance is such a power. It is the reset button for reality, the blade that cuts fate itself, the silence that follows the end of meaning. It is not evil, it is not corruption, it is absolute. And the absolute is incompatible with survival. That is why the Emperor fears it. That is why I died protecting its secrets. That is why it will never be used, even as it can never be destroyed. The Imperium will endure, humanity will survive, the warp will rage, and the rite of severance will wait, incomplete, eternal, a shadow on the edge of possibility. This is my testament. This is my warning. This is the truth that no one must know, and everyone will eventually learn. The right is real, the right is absolute, the right is waiting, and the Emperor is afraid.